In this episode of The Christian Philosopher, we're going to talk about the nature of Christian faith. When you ask a lot of people today about what do you think the word faith means, they are probably going to appeal to something very subjective. They're going to appeal to something on the inside, usually an emotion or some kind of sentiment or like something in their heart. Man, well, what does it mean to have faith? I can just feel it in my heart. In other words, this is a kind of an internal, emotional, sentimental sort of thing, faith. This is exactly not what true Christian faith is. True Christian faith has nothing to do with sentiments, emotions, feelings in the heart. Whatever you want to call it. Traditional Christian faith has absolutely nothing to do with that, nor does it have anything to do with sort of these blind impulses. It's just a blind act of the will. Again, this is not the traditional notion of an act of faith. So we're going to cover here in this video, I want to talk about what is true Christian faith, at least classically understood. I think the classical notion of this idea is very important and a whole lot better than this modern confused idea of an appeal to subjective feelings. So we're going to talk about the traditional notion of Christian faith, most particularly the act of faith and what that means. So we're going to talk about several things in this video. We're going to talk about what faith really means. We're going to go through the different true meanings of faith. And then we're going to talk about why faith is a supernatural virtue and what that means. And then we'll talk about how a person has faith. What does it mean to say faith is in this person? What are they doing, in other words? And then we'll talk about some different divisions of faith. How does faith actually exist in a person? And you'll see how faith can exist in different ways. Let's take that first topic for a second. What does faith really mean? Well, when you look in Scripture, there are actually a wide variety of different meanings for the word faith. For example, you might see faith in there in the sense of confidence. Hey, don't worry, have faith. Things are going to be okay, have faith. Things will turn out okay. So this idea of faith as confidence. Another thing you'll see is faith used in the sense of trust. Hey, don't worry, God is faithful to his promises. And these are all accurate meanings of faith. Another one you'll see is something like the faith. We have a convert to the faith. So in Scripture, all these are accurate. Scripture uses the word faith in many different ways. Now, none of these ways that I just talked about, though, are what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is faith in the strict sense. We mean an act of believing, thinking that something is true. So how do you know that the doctrine of the Trinity is true, right? I know it on the basis of faith. So faith here is taken in a strict sense, meaning that we are thinking that something is in fact true. So what we mean here in this strict sense is when you have faith, you believe something on the basis of an authority. You think that something is true because somebody who knows more than you do told you so. Now, we do this all the time, and it's a very rational thing to do. For example, take common sense beliefs like who your parents are. You probably believe that because someone you trust, hopefully your parents, told you that. Or take, scientific beliefs. Now, most of us haven't conducted all the different scientific experiments that make up our scientific knowledge. No, we read those conclusions in a book, and we trust the author's presentation of that scientific evidence. In other words, we believe these things are true on the basis of faith. We trust the author of that science book, right, to tell us the truth about whatever it is that we're talking about. The same goes for historical beliefs. We don't know those on the basis of our own direct experience, obviously. We have historical knowledge based upon what some historical authority, in fact, told us. So it's a very rational thing to do, and if we didn't do it, we couldn't know hardly anything at all, right? It's a very rational thing to do, to believe something on the basis of a good authority, and we do it all the time. Now, of course, here when we're talking about Christian faith, though, we're talking about not human faith, not believing human authorities, but we're talking about divine faith, believing in God's authority. Now, this is, in fact, another very rational thing to do. If God, and God is as defined in the traditional sense, right? God is an omnipotent, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all good, all truthful being, right? If God told you something, you can be for sure that it is in fact true because God can neither deceive nor be deceived. So this is the idea of faith as a supernatural virtue. We're kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty here when it comes to Christian faith in the divine sense, right? Faith as a supernatural virtue. This is the traditional idea of faith. So a simple definition is faith is a supernatural virtue by which we believe everything that God has revealed because God is the ultimate authority who can neither deceive nor be deceived. So if we dig into that definition a little bit, I think you can see that it's a good one. So for example, God, this idea of God as the ultimate authority. Why would that be the case? Because of the very nature of God. God is omniscient. He knows all things. God is all omnibenevolent, all good, all truthful. And for these reasons, God cannot be deceived. He knows all things, nor can he deceive someone. God can't possibly lie. So God knows all truth and tells all truth. That makes him the ultimate authority. And we call faith here a supernatural virtue. A virtue is just a good habit, but supernatural, why? Why is faith a supernatural virtue? Well, first of all, faith is supernatural in origin. We can't have faith by ourselves. It is, in fact, a gift from God. God infuses faith into our souls. It's a grace from God. We can't make it up ourselves. So it's supernatural in its origin. Faith is also supernatural in another sense. It's supernatural in its motive. Why do you believe this stuff? Well, we believe it because God said so. So the very reason for believing this thing is because God, in fact, said so. So the whole motive of this belief is supernatural as well. And finally, faith can be said to be supernatural in knowledge. There are things that we know by faith that cannot possibly be known in any other way. So, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity. It's impossible to know the Trinity based on science or history or philosophy. No, the only way we can know that the doctrine of the Trinity is true is because God, in fact, has told us that. So faith is also supernatural in this knowledge sense as well. So now let's talk about how a person has faith. What's going on inside their heads? Well, first of all, because the act of faith is thinking that something is true, you're using your mind. You're using your intellect. We say in theology, faith exists in the intellect. You are thinking that something is true. But the intellect is not the only thing that's involved. Faith is always an act of free choice as well. And we'll talk about how faith is always voluntary in a later video. But faith is always an act of choice as well. So there is the will involved. And also it's God's grace. As I said a while ago, God's grace is what moves us to faith. So God's grace, classically understood, moves our wills to choose to believe. So there's a lot going on in our souls, in our minds, so to speak. But there's an action of God's grace. There's an act of our will. But primarily, as the theologians say, faith exists primarily in the intellect. It's also helpful, I think, to understand the different ways faith can exist in a person. We call these the divisions of faith. So one of these ways, the first way, is faith with charity versus faith without charity. So the idea here is that the virtue of faith can exist in someone who is in a state of sanctifying grace, right? I mean, they have this supernatural life in their souls, and then they believe what God says. But also, faith can exist, the same virtue can exist in a soul that is not in a state of sanctifying grace. You can commit a mortal sin and still believe everything God says. So the existence of faith in a soul doesn't have to be a person in a state of grace. The faith can exist in someone who is not in a state of grace at all. Another common division we make is living faith versus dead faith. In living faith, we're talking about faith accompanied by good works. So this is a kind of a phrase that comes from the Epistle of James. So faith accompanied by good works, that would be a living faith. But you get the kind of person who just kind of believes, but they don't really do anything. A lot of people, right? that would be called a dead faith, a faith that's not producing any good fruit, a faith that's not producing any acts of charity. So we have this other distinction here between living faith and dead faith. And the final distinction that I think is helpful to understand is the distinction between divine faith and divine Catholic faith. Now, this is a division that we Catholics make, but I think it's very important to understand how theology can progress over time and how doctrines can be more clarified over time. So this is the idea that divine faith, okay, that refers to everything that God has revealed, okay? And then there's divine Catholic faith that refers to everything God has revealed and has been proposed for our belief by the church. There's that additional criterion in there. So there's divine faith, everything that God has revealed, and then there is divine Catholic faith, that is everything God has revealed, plus it has now been defined for us to believe by the church. This, I think, is important for understanding how theology can progress. So God gives this sort of initial deposit of faith in the beginning. It never changes. Okay, it stopped at the death of the last apostle. But our knowledge can grow over time. So God has always, revealed the doctrine of the Trinity. But over time, the church and our theologians can reflect and make certain ideas that were implicit, explicit, and propose those for our belief in terms of formal definitions. So this is another important understanding of faith, because it tells us how theology can progress, at least in our minds. So there's the divine faith, and there's divine Catholic faith as well. All right, so I hope all this helps you understand a little bit better what the traditional Christian understanding of faith is. It's not some blind appeal to the will or to the emotions or a warm fuzzy in the heart. We're talking about an act of the intellect. It's not believing things without evidence, and we'll get into that later on. But it is an act of believing based upon a reliable authority. We do this, as I said, all the time with good human authorities, and it's reasonable to do so with God as well. So with divine faith, we believe things because God has in fact revealed them. It's a very reasonable thing to do. God is all-knowing and all good and all truthful, so if he tells you something, you should in fact believe it. It can't possibly be wrong. Now, some people might be wondering, okay, well, that kind of makes sense, right? Sure, if God in fact told me things, then I should believe it. But how do I know God did so? How do I know that there was in fact any revelation that I should believe at all? That's a topic for another video. Hey guys, just real quickly here, if you like these videos and you want to learn more about some of the stuff that I teach, you can visit my website, scottmsullivan.com. I have what I call the Aquinas School of Theology and Philosophy. We have courses in logic, philosophy, theology, a whole bunch of stuff. You can check it out. We have a free trial. It's available on my website. Again, check it out, scottmsullivan.com.